Hi, everybody. Welcome back to dinanddaf. This is Elana Stein Hain, and today we're going to talk about Shavuot. But we're not going to just generally talk about Shavuot. We actually did that in a shir. I think it's called The World of Shavuot from back in March. It's in our dinanddaf archives. But we are going to talk about a very particular halakha offered by Rabbi Abba in the Gemara in Bava Batra, Lamed Gimel, Lamed Bet, Lamed Dalet, Lamed Aleph, which is that if a person is supposed to take a shvua, but they're unable to take that shvua, then they have to pay instead. Now, of course, what we're talking about here comes up in a situation where the person who's supposed to take a shvua is a defendant, and the defendant's supposed to take a shvua in order to be exempt from having to pay. The example in Bava Batra, Lamed Gimel, Lamed Bet, Lamed Dalet, Lamed Aleph is Naska de Rabbi Abba, which is a situation where somebody grabbed a piece of silver. I think the fancy word in English for it is an ingot, I-N-G-O-T, grabbed a piece of silver from someone else, and the plaintiff brought an eid echad to say, this defendant grabbed this piece of silver, and the defendant says, yes, I did grab that piece of silver, but it's mine. Now, usually, there is a shvua min haTorah that is administered in case where there's an eid echad that says something and a defendant that claims the opposite. But in this case, you can't have a shvua like that because the defendant is not claiming the opposite. The defendant's saying, yeah, you're right, eid echad. I did take this thing, but I took it because it was mine. So this is a classic case for Rabbi Abba. It's a classic case of someone who's mechuyav in a shvua, but in a choli shava, they can't. So instead of the usual situation where you have a shvua d'oraita and the defendant is nishba v'niftar, nishbad v'nifteret, makes an oath and doesn't have to pay, in this situation, the defendant does have to pay. Now, I want to think about this. I want to do two things in this brief shir. The first thing I want to do is I want to think about the logic of this and the two possible ways we could think about Rabbi Abba's halakha. And I'll tell you what those two possible ways are in a minute. And the second thing that I want to do is I want to compare this with a different kind of case where the defendant can't take a shvua. And that is a case where a defendant can't take a shvua, not because it doesn't make sense to take a shvua, they can't actually swear to the thing that they're supposed to swear to, but because they're chashud ala shvua, because they're not somebody who we trust to take a shvua. They're somebody who lied in the past under oath. There's somebody who is what's called this mesachik b'kubya, is somebody who's a gambler, right? That's a different situation where a person should take a shvua but can't take a shvua. And in that situation, we say something different. We actually say that the plaintiff in that situation takes a shvua and then gets to take whatever it is that they're claiming. So I want to understand why Rabbi Abba says here in the case where somebody has to take a shvua and they can't take a shvua because the shvua wouldn't make sense, right? They have to be just mishalim, they pay. Whereas in the case of somebody who's chashud ala shvua, chashudat ala shvua, where we just don't believe them to take a shvua, in that situation, we flip the requirement for the shvua to the other party, and the other party is able to take the money. So in both situations, the defendant ends up paying, but in the chashud case, we at least make the plaintiff take a shvua. Whereas in our Rabbi Abba case, we just say that the defendant has to pay and the plaintiff doesn't have to do anything special for it, right? So let's just talk about the logic of being mechuyav in a shvua and having to be mishalim instead because you can't, right? There's two logical possibilities for why this would be the case, okay? The first logical possibility is to suggest that actually, originally, the defendant really is chayav l'shalim, right? Take the case where you have one aid saying you did it, right? One aid saying you did it, and you say I didn't do it. Not the Naska de Rabbi Abba case where you say I did it, but it was mine. I didn't do it. In that case, there is a shvua Torah that the defendant has to take. And really, me'ikar hadin, we might say, principally the defendant is chayav. The defendant is obligated to pay. But instead of paying, we allow them to take a shvua, right? Now, how would you understand the logic of this? You might say you're chayav to pay, but if you do something that shows enough investment in the truth of your claim and you're willing to kind of go to bat for it, then instead of being mishalem, this somehow, the fact that you have to take a shvua is somehow, compensatory. Maybe the other person doesn't get much out of it, but like you're doing something. But that's one way to go. And if that's the way you would think, that me'ikar hadin, in a lot of these places where there's a shvua min haTorah, it's really because the defendant really should have to pay, but it's the shvua that's getting them out of it. Then, of course, when you read Rabbi Abba, who says, if you're required to take a shvua and you can't take a shvua, then you pay. Of course, because the shvua was only there to get you out of a payment that you were already required to give. And if you don't have the shvua anymore, it just reverts to the ikar hadin, right? That's one way to look at it. There's another way to look in general at the chiyuv shvua, the requirement to take a shvua in these shvua d'oraita cases. And that is, maybe me'ikar hadin, you're not chayav money at all, the defendant. And actually, in some sense, it's almost a chumrah that we're making you take a shvua. And maybe that's sort of to provide some sort of evidence or further assurance that you're telling the truth. But me'ikar hadin, we don't actually think that you're chayav, right? So, for example, in a case where an eid echad says to me, you did such and such, and I say, no, I didn't. Actually, because it's not two eidim, I'm really not chayav in anything. But I have to take a shvua to show that what I'm saying, I really believe what I'm saying is true, and I really have to establish it as fact, right? If that's the way you think about shvua in general, that they're not a substitute for money, they're actually a different din altogether, then Rabbi Abba is actually far more radical. Because if you can't take a shvua, then we're going to make you pay money. Wow, like we've really changed your din. Because really, me'ikar hadin, you shouldn't have had to pay anything. And now, because you can't take a shvua, we're making you pay. Why would we do that? Is it because now we lack evidence? Is this a penalty against you because you can't take a shvua? So these are some of the things that I want to think about. So the first thing I want to say, and I don't even think I'm going to read this inside because God willing, you'll get to Masachet Shvuot and you'll read this inside. But what I want to say is that there is an interesting case in the Gemara in Shvuot, Mem Zayin Amud Aleph to Mem Zayin Amud Bet, where another case of Rabbi Abba's principle comes up. It's not an eid echad situation, but it's a moda b'miktzat hatana situation, right? I say you owe 100, you say you owe 50. Usually, there should be a din d'oraita that you would take a shvua because you're moda b'miktzat hatana. You admitted to some of my claim, but not all of my claim. I said 100, you said 50. So you take a shvua and you don't have to pay. But the Gemara in Shvua presents a different kind of example that's like akin to it. Just like Naska de Rabbi Abba was akin to a regular case of having one aid and then contradicting that aid by the defendant. So here the case is you have a malveh, you have a lender, and you have a loveh, you have a borrower. And the malveh says to the loveh, hey, you owe me $100. And the loveh, instead of saying the classic moda b'miktzat hatana, the loveh says, I know I owe you 50, but I don't know about the other 50. So what's the halakha there? So the Gemara there indicates that we would also use Rabbi Abba's logic there and say, because the loveh, because the defendant can't take a shvua, I don't owe you the other 50. The defendant is now going to have to pay instead, okay? But then the Gemara brings up another example that's adjacent that is like compared to that, to this new example for the Rabbi Abba principle. And that is, what if instead of the original lender and the original borrower, it's their heirs? So the heir of the original lender says to the heir of the original borrower, your dad owed my dad $100. The heir of the original borrower says, I know my dad owed your dad 50, but I don't know about the rest. Is there a chiyuv shvua there? Is there a chiyuv tashlum in there? And the Gemara says, no, on the basis of a limud that Rabbi Ami makes from a pasuk in Parshat Mishpatim that says Shvuat Hashem tiyeh ben shnehem, that a shvua is between the two original litigants, meaning v'lo ben hayorshin, and not between the heirs. So here, the Gemara in Shvua presents a new kind of situation where Rabbi Abba's principle would come up, not an Eid Echad kind of Shvua, but a Moda b'miktzah kind of Shvua. And they want to say that when it comes to the original Malva and Lova, if that happened, the Lova would not be able to take their Shvua because they're saying, I'm not sure about the last 50, rather than saying, I know I don't owe you the last 50. But if it was, and therefore would have to pay instead. But if it was their Yorshim talking to each other, their heirs talking to each other, the heirs of the Lova would not have to pay and would not have to take a shvua. Okay, this is really interesting because it actually leads the right, Rabbeinu Yitzchak in the Balei Tosfot. It leads him to try to understand, okay, if this idea of chiyuv shvua and having to pay seems to apply to the original litigants, but doesn't seem to apply to the Yorshim, to the heirs, maybe that can help me figure out what the logic is of this chiyuv shvua. If you can't do it, then you have to pay. Okay, so let's take a look at the Balei Tosfot. And these Balei Tosfot, they come up in Daf Mem Vav Amud Aleph in Bava Kama, and the reason they come up there is because there's a different situation where the Balei Tosfot are like, hey, how come we're not using Rabbi Abba here? But I'm not going to go into it now. We don't have enough time to really develop it. I want to really develop what the Re comes up with as the logic behind this Rabbi Abba's mechuyev shvua has to pay if they can't take the shvua. So I actually want to just look here. His question is, why is it that if it's the original Malva and Lova, that the Lova would have to take a shvua, and if they can't take the shvua because they're saying, I don't know about the other 50, they would have to pay. But with the Yorshim, if the same thing was said, then the Yorshim would not have to take a shvua and would not have to pay. This is what he says. Elahainu tama diba'av chayav lo yadana. Here's the reason why with the father, meaning the original Lova, saying, I don't know about the last 50, that in that situation, we would say, sorry, because you can't take a shvua that you don't owe that last 50, owe that last 50, like a modem mixat usually would, you're going to have to be mishalim instead. Why? Tahaya lo leida im chayav lo maneh ilav. Because the Lova should have known. Aval Yorshim, but the heirs, lo haya lahem leida b'milei de'avuhom, they didn't have to know. Now, this is really interesting because it makes it sound like if a Malva says, you owe me 100, and the Lova says, I know I owe you 50, but I don't know about the last 50. The reason why we say, oh, well, this Lova can't take a shvua, so they're going to have to be mishalim, it's a penalty. It's essentially saying, yeah, like if you did say you knew what happened to the other 50 and that they're not owed, right, then you would get off with a shvua and you'd be fine. But the fact is, the fact that you don't know this, you can't take a shvua, and therefore we're going to penalize you by making you pay, right? It's not that there was always a chiyuv tashlumin all the way, all along, and that the shvua got you out of it, and now that the shvua is gone, you have to pay. It's because you don't know well enough in order to be able to take the shvua that you know that you don't owe those other 50, and you should have known well enough, we're now going to penalize you and make you pay, right? Which is not something we would do to heirs, right? Because why would the heirs know? They're not going to know everything about their father's ledger, right? Like, so here the Re is really looking at this as, oh, this din of Rabbi Abba of where you're mechuyev b'shvua, but you can't take a shvua. That's actually the fact that you have to pay. Not because originally there was a chiyuv mamon and the shvua would have gotten you out of it. And now that we have no shvua, it reverts to the chiyuv mamon. It's no. There should have been a shvua. You should have known what you were talking about. And the fact that you don't know what you're talking about, now you're tough. You're up a creek. You now have to pay. There was no original chiyuv mamon, but because you don't know what you're talking about, you should have known better. Now, this is so interesting because it's like the idea that it would be a penalty is so interesting because take it back to the Naska the Rabbi Abba case. So the Naska the Rabbi Abba case, I took something, the defendant took something, an Eid Echad said, you took it, and the defendant said, but it's mine. And Rabbi Abba says, or Rabbi Abba rules, okay, so the defendant is going to have to pay because the defendant's not saying, no, I didn't take it. The defendant is agreeing with the Eid Echad. So what is it that we're punishing the defendant for here? Is it the fact that the defendant grabbed something? Maybe it was silly of them to do that in public. Like meaning that logic that the Re offers for a situation where a Lova doesn't remember what happened to the other $50, it just doesn't seem to work in the situation around Rabbi Abba, right? So that pushes me to say that maybe there are some situations where Rabbi Abba's halakha of if you're mechuyev in a shvua but you can't pay it, then you have to be mishalim. Some situations it looks more like we're giving you a penalty, and in other situations it looks more like no. If you grab something from somebody and an Eid Echad sees you grab it, me'ikar din, you actually have a chiyuv mamon, but we are able to somehow let it go so long as you offer a shvua. But if you can't offer a shvua, it just reverts to its original default. It's not a punishment of any sort. It's not a penalty of any sort. It's just reverting to the original, right? So you have here sort of this question of like, how much is shvua a kula? Because really, me'ikar hadin, you should have had to pay, and a shvua lets you off the hook a little bit easier. And how much is shvua actually like a chumrah? Because originally you shouldn't have to pay anything, but we're making you take a shvua just to be like evidentiarily very careful. And the way those two things end up sort of mapping on to the cases of Rabbi Abba is that sometimes we basically say, no, you shouldn't have had to pay, but because you're not able to take a shvua because of your own malfeasance, you should have known where the other $50 were and whether you owed it or you don't owe it. Then we're going to make you be mishalim. Whereas in the case of Naska the Rabbi Abba, we're sort of like, it seems like when you have the Eid Echad, there's a tashlumin responsibility to begin with, and usually you could get rid of it with a shvua. In this situation, you can't. It's not any fault of your own per se, but we just revert to the original. So these are just two different ways of thinking about shvua and tashlumin, and it's two different ways of thinking about whether when we make you take a shvua, we're being machmir on you or we're being mekel on you, right? Which is interesting. And I don't know, I think it would be interesting to look at when people talk about the logic behind taking a shvua against an Eid Echad versus taking a shvua and modeh b'miktzat. Are there different logics behind each of those? Maybe not all shvuot Torah are the same, right? Meaning maybe sometimes we're giving you a shvuot Torah because we're trying to be machmir on you and say you got to be extra careful. Maybe sometimes we're giving you the requirement to do a shvuot Torah because really me'ikar din, you should have to be mishalim and we're being mekel on you, right? It doesn't have to be that every shvuot Torah is the same, right? But it's just something interesting to think about. So that's sort of layer one. Layer two is, I mentioned that there is another major situation where a person is supposed to take a shvua, but they can't, quote unquote, take a shvua, which is not where they can't actually swear that the thing that they're supposed to swear is true. They can't swear that the other $50 they don't owe, and they can't swear that they didn't grab something. But it's a situation where they should take a shvua, they could take a shvua, but they're not believed to take a shvua because they're people who are chashudim ala shvua, right? So, for example, if you look at Mishnah and Shvuot, Parak Zion, Mishnah Aleph, right, where we said you find these conversations about Shvuot, take a look. An example, right? So we said in general, the category, and this is back in the shir about the world of Shvuot, the category of Shvuot that are called Shvuot HaTorah or Shvuot Min HaTorah are generally categories for a defendant to take a Shvuah and not have to pay, right? But the Elu Nishba'in V'Notlin. But here's a category, a Tanaitic category of rabbinic Shvuot, called Shvuot HaMishnah, for clear reasons that you're looking at a Mishnah here, right? And these are the situations where it's not the defendant who takes a Shvuah and is Ptura from then paying. It's the plaintiff who takes a Shvuah and is then able to take what they're claiming, right? These are the people who are Nishba'in V'Notlin, where the plaintiff, the Rabbanon, has to take a Shvuah in order to get something. And interestingly, look at one of the people on the list, Shekenegdo Hashud al Shvuah. If the defendant is somebody who can't take a Shvuah because they're not believable, because they lied under oath at some other point, or they're Misachik Bekubya, things like that, right? So here you have a situation where this is different from Rabbi Abba, right? Rabbi Abba's case, it's if you're mechuyev to take a shvuah, but you can't take a shvuah because you can't swear to the thing you're supposed to swear to, that would undermine the claim of the other side. This is different. This is, I'm a plaintiff. There's a defendant. The defendant should take a shvuah, probably one of those shvuot min haTorah, right? They should take a shvuah. Maybe they were motive miktzat. Maybe I have an eid echad. And they really do want to claim that what I said is wrong, and they could really make the shvuah, but we don't trust them. They're in the category of chashd al shvuah because of lying under oath in the past, right? In that situation, what do? We don't just say the defendant pays the way Rabbi Abba does. We say the plaintiff has to take a shvuah and then can collect the money. So in both cases, Rabbi Abba and this, the defendant pays. But it is really interesting that we force the plaintiff to take a shvuah in the case where somebody else is chashd al shvuah. Why don't we say, like, by the way, ultimate penalty, you're chashd al shvuah, sorry, you have to pay. Like, if we want to talk about penalty, you should have to pay, right? As a penalty for not being able to take a shvuah, right? So I think that's a really interesting question, because it also, like, sort of continues the conversation about not just how do we think about what a shvuah is, but also how do we want to set up the court system so that it is both honest and not exploitative. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. Let's take a look at what Tosfot asked here. Okay, you ready? So the Tosfot about Metzia Daf Hey, which is also on a different on a different conversation. As you can see, this spans a lot of your places in Shas. She says, well, V'im Tomar, and if you say, why should this be different? Why is Rabbi Abba's Halakha of the mechuyev shvuah is chayav l'shalem? Why is that different than a situation where the mechuyev shvuah is chashud, and therefore we make the other side, the plaintiff, take the shvuah, right? Why don't we just say that because the defendant can't take a shvuah because they're chashud al shvuah, they should pay? Like we say in a case where the defendant says, I know that I owe 50 and I don't know about the other 50. Why isn't this, right? Uva naska de Rabbi Abba, or in the naska de Rabbi Abba case, right? Where I took it, but it's mine and I can't take a shvuah. What's the difference between not being able to take a shvuah because I'm chashud on a shvuah and not being able to take a shvuah because I can't actually swear to the thing I'm supposed to swear to? So Tosfot gives two answers. So here's an answer. Hacha, iyamrinan mishalim. In the situation of someone who's chashud al shvuah, who's supposed to take a shvuah in court, but they're chashud. If we said that in every situation that the defendant is a person who is chashud al shvuah, that the defendant just immediately has to pay, because we want to apply Rabbi Abba to this kind of thing as well, then guess what? Lo shavak lechaya, You haven't given this defendant a chance in their life. Because everybody is going to come at that guy, take that person to court, and because that person is chashuv shvua, any claim they make, that guy is going to have to always pay. Meaning it leaves the chashuv shvua, which, by the way, I would have thought was so caring about the chashuv shvua, right? Like, it leaves that person vulnerable because there's no burden of proof. There's like no burden of proof. People could just come, make claims against that person, and say, well, you're a chashuv shvua. You shouldn't have lied under oath last time. I'm making a claim against you. You have to pay me money, right? Like that, it leaves them vulnerable. Now, I don't know the way that Tosfot say it as it leaves them vulnerable makes it sound like, oh, never for the litigant, the defendant who's chashuv shvua. I think you could also say it as, we actually don't want a kangaroo court where people just walk in willy-nilly knowing that there are certain people that they can make claims against and there's no burden of proof, right? Like, it's not great for the court system either, right? But that's one answer that the Balei HaTosfot gave. Why don't we apply Rabbi Abba here? Because you can't have somebody who just, there's, everybody knows that they're like an instant cash machine, right? So that's one. A second, va'od, another reason offered for the difference between a case where someone's chashuv shvua and it means that then the plaintiff has to take a shvua versus the Rabbi Abba case where you can't take the shvua because it wouldn't be true. So you have to pay. Here's another reason. Va'od, dahatam amarle shvua d'oraita itli alem. Because in the case of the Naska de Rabbi Abba, or the case of the I know about 50 and I don't know about the other 50. They say there is a shvua min haTorah that I have against you. O tishava, o tishalim, right? Either you should be swearing or you should be paying, which, by the way, goes with kind of the non-penalty, in my opinion, goes with the non-penalty read of this. It's like they're substitutes for each other, swearing or paying, right? Aval hacha, but in a case of someone who's chashuv shvua, hu b'ratzon yishavayim nanichenu. This person would happily take a shvua if we allowed them to. Ulakach lo yishalim. Therefore, you can't make them pay, right? How can you make somebody pay who's saying, I'm willing to take a shvua, I'm willing to take a shvua, I'm willing to take a shvua? So we're just not allowing them to take a shvua because they're chashuv, right? Now, it sounds like also we're not saying like, oh, the chashuv is considered a rasha. This also seems like you can't make, it's not the same when the court says we won't accept your shvua as when it's impossible to make the shvua to begin with. These are different things. Now, I'll end with what I think is very interesting, which is the Rambam, on the basis of the Gaonim, basically looks back, and I'm putting words in his mouth, but I'll tell you the answer to the question that I'm putting in his mouth, which is, okay, got it. So in a case of someone who's chashuv shvua, we don't want them to become an instant cash machine. So we say, if they come to a situation where they have to take a shvua, but they're chashuv shvua, make the plaintiff take a shvua, right? And then they can take the money. But don't just make them be mishalim. Whereas in the case of Rabbi Abba, you could just make the defendant be mishalim. So Rambam was like, well, who's going to protect the person in the case of 50 I know and 50 I don't? Who's going to protect the person in the case of Naska the Rabbi Abba? What's to keep somebody from coming with a spurious claim there too? Right? And so the Rambam quotes, based on the Gaonim, says, V'yesh lo lahakrim al misha toin alai davar she'eno yodea bivadai shani chayav. Says the defendant can say, I want to make a conditional chayrim on somebody who comes at me with a claim that they don't for sure know that I am required to pay, right? Because otherwise, you could have a situation where somebody comes up with a claim, and because I say, I took it, but it was mine, or because I say, I don't know what happened to the other 50, I just have to be mishalemet. I just have to pay. But the Gaonim basically said, actually, the defendant could say, chayrim on anybody who comes and makes such a claim if they don't know that it's true, right? It's a way to keep people from using this person as a cash machine also. So basically what we saw here is Shvua could be in the place of Tashlumin, and really a chiyuv mamon is already there, but the Shvua takes it away, which makes it like a kula. Or it could be that a Shvua is the actual din and there's no chiyuv tashlumin, but if you can't do a Shvua, then we penalize you by requiring you to pay. And it seems like in a situation where you can't take a Shvua because you're hashud, we still want the other litigant to have to take a Shvua. We want there to be like more of an evidentiary process because we don't want people to take advantage. And the Gaonim also put into place something. They didn't require the plaintiff to take a Shvua, but they did put into place something to protect a defendant who might get taken advantage of based on the principle of Rabbi Abba. As always, great learning with you.